share. Okay. All right.
I don't think you replace it. So what do you press here? Is this remote?
The middle button.
Okay. I don't think you replace it. Yes. No, let me take out the battery. Anyone? Batteries? Spare batteries with you?
Yeah, slightly different battery. We got stuff in that time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna put it back there.
Okay. So our discussion today is Bedin Emanut Mechonat HaPolygraph. Is a polygraph machine admissible in Beis Din? Can you hold someone liable to pay money based on a polygraph test? So, Marvin, you were telling us yesterday that legally in Canada it's not admissible, even if someone fails a polygraph test. Inadmissible. So why do people do it? Okay. I think it's also not admissible. I don't know. Anyway, yesh lahakdim tchilat mahalach pulat machshir hapolygraph. Let us first introduce this subject by explaining how a polygraph works. Abodeket aminut ha'adam hanechkar, that tests the trustworthiness of the person in question. A polygraph hu machshir shemoded tuguvot hitragshut o charada. It is a machine that measures the levels of emotion or fear. Lifnei shematzigim she'ilot lenechkar, before we present the questions to the questioned individual, matzmidim le'etzba'o electroda lemedidat tchunot chashmaliot shel ha'or. We attach to his finger an electrode that measures the electrical levels of his skin. Et zroa hanechkar otvim bekarit shel machshir lebedikat lachatz dam. We also attach to his arm a cushion, what do you call it? A pressure cuff. That's what it's called. It's called a cuff that measures the blood pressure. And then we also attach a gauge on his chest to measure the depth of his breathing. So there's three different things. One is on his finger, one is on his arm, and one is on his chest. On the other end, at the machinery, you have needles that are attached to a certain panel. And the machine has three channels, each one having its own needle. And every needle moves measuring the the inner feelings of the examined. V'chasher adam mishaker, anechkar bolea et harok, v'notzer yovesh bepiv. He says when a person is lying, the person typically tends to swallow his saliva, get dry mouth, the lachatz damo ole, his blood pressure rises, v'hunimna milihistakel be'enei hashoel, and he turns away without looking at the interrogator. V'chaser menucha, and he lacks a peace of mind. Umatchil linshom lirevacha la'achar shegamar l'shaker, and then he breathes deeply after lying. Vazeh efshar legalot al yedei hapolygraph shehanechkar shiker, and you're able to use that as an indicator that the person is lying. Aval bedikot elu lo yecholot lahashpi al adam sheshata terufat harga'a. He says, however, these kinds of exams do not work on a person who has consumed a tranquilizer or a sedative, ayef, or if he's tired, or if he's ra'ev, or if he's hungry, or a person who believes his lies. In other words, if a person is a sociopath, it's simply not going to work. That's really the definition of a sociopath. He's so convinced about himself that he believes his own lies. Gam ha'anashim ha'oskim bazeh modim she'en latet imun bil'adi lemechunat ha'emet ki lefa'amim hi to'ah. He says, you also, even people who administer polygraph exams will tell you that you cannot rely on it exclusively because at times it does err. Kagon ba'ofen sha'adam mitragesh, such as in a time, let's say a person gets very emotional just because he's put in this situation of being interrogated. That in itself is enough to make him emotional. O azipanim shiodim lishlot b'tekuvoteya. Or you have, on the other extreme, sociopaths, azepanim, impudent people, who know how to suppress their emotions. V'chein yeshnan tofaot domot gam etzel hashakran v'gam etzel hapachtan, and there are also other phenomena that you'll find by people who are both liars and naturally fearful, who become frightened of the polygraph machine even when they're speaking the truth. Ve'ein safek shehatzlachat habedika shel hapolygraph ba'anashim shemishuchrarim mikol hagivulot eino begeder vadai. He says, and there's undoubtedly the success of a polygraph when it comes to people who are completely outside all confines. That's literally what he means to say. Eino begeder vadai ki ba'achuzim mesuyamim hamechona lo poelet b'kivun hanachon legilui ha'emet. You can't say with certainty that the polygraph machine is conclusive in its determination of whether a person is telling the truth or lying, because there's always going to be a percentage of people who will fail the test, will give a false positive or a false negative. So now let's deal with our shaila. Hine kasav harambam ein beitin onshim ba'omed hadat ela al pi edim beraya berura. So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Sanhedrin that a beis din cannot penalize an individual based on their own estimation. In other words, if the guy looks like a weasel and he seems to be lying, then that's not enough to hold him liable. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, by the way. There is something that the Gemara calls a din meruma, when the beis din smells a rat and they know absolutely that there's some contrived case here. They can, under certain circumstances, hold a person liable when there's consensus that we don't know exactly what it is, but we know that this person is lying. Is there such a thing in?
Guy looks like a snake or whatever, he's fidgety, shaky, whatever. You're not supposed to base it on that, generally speaking, but it gets to the point where you might just feel that that's a pretty important factor. So one amongst others, but you could give it weight. You could give them something.
Afilu ro eidim shu rodef achar chavero, v'hitru bo, v'ha'elimu einehem. And to the point where, let's say witnesses saw Ruvain running after Shimon, and v'hitru bo, and they said, hey, you better not harm Shimon. If you harm Shimon, you're going to be liable. V'ha'elimu einehem. And then they turned away. Oshenichnasu achrav lechurva, v'nichnasu acharav u'mitza'u harugu mifarper v'hasayif minatef dam biyad ha'orei. And they see that Shimon has a wound, a knife wound, and he is gasping his last gasps, and Ruvain is holding a bloody dagger. Okay? Hoel v'lo ra'uhu be'eshi hikahu ein based in hargum be'edazeh. Even though there is a ton of circumstantial evidence that Ruvain has murdered Shimon, they cannot incriminate Shimon based on the circumstantial evidence. Yes, it's true that Ruvain was running after Shimon. Now he's holding a dagger and Shimon is dead or dying, but that's not enough to incriminate, because maybe Ruvain was running after Shimon to protect him. Stop, don't go into that cave, or don't go into that ruin. And all of a sudden, someone came and stabbed him and threw the knife to Ruvain. And maybe that's what happened. Okay, you never know. Umikaro tahor meha Gemara b'Sanhedrin b'Maisa im Reb Shimon ben Shetach. And the Gemara actually brings a story like that with Rabbi Shimon ben Shetach. Let me just see where this Gemara. He quotes the Gemara in the bottom. Tanya, Amar Reb Shimon ben Shetach, Era bin Nechama, im lo ra'isi echad sheratz achar chaveru l'churva. He says, I do declare. He says, I once saw a person running after his friend into a ruin. V'ratzti achrav, and I ran after him. V'ra'iti sayaf biyado v'domo mitaftei v'harug mefarper. And I saw him holding a sword dripping with blood, and the victim was taking his last breaths. V'amarti lo, Rasha mi hargo lazeh. And I said to him, wicked one, who is the killer? O ani o ata, did I kill him or did you kill him? Avol ma'a e'eseh she'ein damcha masur biyadi. But what can I do? Your blood is not in my hands to take. Shaharei amr Torah al pi shnayim edim yumas hames. Because the Torah, after all, said that you can only incriminate someone in court based on two witnesses. Ayodea machshavos yifra me'oso ha'isha harages chavera. And therefore, may he who knows all thoughts exact vengeance from the man who killed this victim. Amru lo zazu misham ad sheba nachash v'hikisho v'ames. And then immediately after Reb Shimon ben Shetach pronounced his curse, a snake, a deadly snake, came and bit the man who was holding the sword, and he died. Okay, so that's the story in the Gemara. Umavur mizeh shekol zman she'ein raya v'yediah zenichlal begeder umdana. What we see from that case of the Gemara is that so long as there's no proof and there's no actual knowledge of what happened, it is considered to be in the realm of umdana, where it seems to us that this is the fact, these are the facts, but we don't know for sure. And even though you can tell from the look on his face that he's the perpetrator, mikol makom or shal panav, or at face value, it's clear. There's like so much circumstantial evidence that this is what happened. Mikol makom ein holchem achar umdinus, but we don't go according to estimations and assessments. V'lav davka b'dinei nefashos elegam b'dinei mammos. This is not true only by capital crime, but it's true by financial crime as well. He says, however, we do know that the Gemara does make an allowance of when there's a preponderance of circumstantial evidence, that you can follow that, as the Rambam himself writes, sheyesh ledayan ladun b'dinei mamonus al pi hadvarim shedato nota lahen shein emes. A judge should follow what he feels is the truth. V'hadavar chazak b'libo shu kain. And sometimes if he sees very clearly in his heart that the facts are as he portrays them, afal pi she'ein sham raya berura, even though there's not absolute evidence, ve'ein tzarich lomar imhu yodea bevadai shadavar kenu, and certainly when the judge knows what's going on, shehudan kefi ma sheyodea, that a judge should judge based on what he believes to be the truth. Mikol makom ein safek shebedikas hapolygraph hirak umdana she'ena muchachas, v'lachein ein lismoch aleha klal uchlal. So the Rambam, he grants that the Rambam does write that especially in financial cases, you can follow what you believe to be true, even when you don't have absolute evidence and the evidentiary standards have not been met according to halacha. But a judge still can rule according to what he feels is who is in the right and who's in the wrong. But a polygraph doesn't even rise to that level, because it's really just one contributing sort of basis to incriminate a person, but there's so many things that can go wrong. Ubifrat lefi ma shekasav harambam. This is especially true based on what the Rambam then writes in that same place. The Misharabu Batei Din Sheinam Hagunim. He says there over the generations, certain Batei Dinim sprouted up that were not really expert Batei Din, and they didn't really judge properly. Vafilu hayu hagunim b'maaseihem enam chachamim karoyu balei bina. And certain Batei Din arose that were comprised of very frum gentlemen, but did not have adequate wisdom and did not understand the human condition sufficiently. Lo yadun hadayin b'smichas daito. So therefore, in more recent generations, a judge should not judge based on what he thinks is correct, based on his estimation. That a judge should never say, well, this guy's more believable to me than the other guy, right? You have to know that was true in earlier generations when people were much wiser and more discerning about the nature of human nature. The Rambam writes, but in more recent generations, we've seen a lot of judges get the wool pulled over their eyes. And by the way, if that was true in the 13th century, just imagine, the 12th century, I should say, and imagine how true it is in the 21st century, where people, you just go on the media and you see how convincing people are to even, say, defend Hamas, right? People are so righteously indignant today and come across as so sincere and passionate about their convictions, and they don't know what the heck they're talking about, and they deliberately lie. And therefore, you should certainly not rely on a polygraph. The Gemara actually says a similar idea in its interpretation of a verse in Koheles, which says, Bikesh Kohelet limtzo divrei chayfetz uchtov yosher divrei emet. So Koheles, the author of this work, sought to find words that are desirable and to write down proper words and words of truth. The Ritzono Lomar, what does this mean according to the Gemara? Shebikesh Kohelet ladun dinin shebalev shelo be'edim v'shelo behatra. That Shlomo HaMelech, who was the author Koheles, he wanted to be able to judge criminal cases without witnesses and without the perpetrator having been forewarned, because Shlomo was so wise that he was able to look into the depths of a person's thoughts and be able to figure out just by looking at a facial expression and being able to hear a person speak, he was able to know with certainty whether a person was telling the truth or not. Right? And that's why a heavenly voice, according to the Gemara, cried out the words of the Pasuk to write down that which is upright and words of truth. In other words, even Shlomo HaMelech, you don't have the right to do that because you have to look at what is written in the Sefer of Emes, the Sefer of Truth, which is the Torah, where it says that you can only convict a person with two witnesses. Uperish Hamaretz Chias Sham Sheratza Shlomo HaMelech Ladun Al Pi HaUmdana Kikach Asa B'Mishpat Shtei Hanashim. And the Maretz Chias, the commentary, writes that this is the reason why Shlomo felt confident that he was able to judge based on assessing the litigants alone was because he saw how successful he was in that famous story that's recorded in Tanakh about the two women, each one claiming that the baby was theirs. And King Solomon said, cut the baby in half. And he was able to see who was the real mother when the one woman said, give the baby to her, to the other woman, right? And so he knew that she was the real mother. The kivein la'emes l'chein ratza ladun kach tamid, and that's why he felt that now that I sort of have broken the code, I know exactly how people behave. I can do that in other situations as well. Umin hashamayim manu et Shlomo hamelech hachacham mikol adam ladun shelo al pi edim, and heaven came forward and said, no, right? Okay, you got lucky, or not lucky, but you were successful once. But that doesn't mean that you can do that all the time. Even Shlomo HaMelech did not have a right to do that. What? Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, this does have benefits for security purposes. You can certainly profile someone and interrogate them and understand when they're lying and when they're not lying. Al achat kama v'kama she'in makom lihistayeya b'psikat ha'halacha lefi polygraph. And therefore, certainly nowadays, we cannot come to a decision of halacha based upon a polygraph. Aval beit hadin yachol lishtamesh b'bedikat polygraph kisiyua shema yodeh hanechkar b'ma'aseh aval lo lechayev mamon al piv. What the Beis Din can do is they can use a polygraph exam to try to put pressure on a person to confess. In other words, we can say to him, hey, bud, like, are you willing to submit to a polygraph exam? Come on. If you feel that, you're saying that you don't owe him the money, and he seems to have a lot of circumstantial evidence against you, and it seems like, this is your third or fourth time appearing before the Beis Din. How about if you take a polygraph exam? Like, if the Beis Din smells a rat, then they should try to figure out ways to get the guy to finally confess. But if the guy holds fast, even after failing the test, and says, I'm innocent, I didn't do anything, they can't obligate him money based on the polygraph exam alone. And oh, right. And he says in the footnote, he says that's exactly the same kind of idea that we discussed when we talked about the previous discussion about using women's testimony, right? Even though women's testimony can be used in Beis Din, but there are a number of Batei Din, even when they will accept a woman's testimony, they use it only for trying to put pressure on one of the litigants. In other words, they say, well, Mrs. Schwartz clearly saw what you did, so you might as well let's not prolong this case. They'll meet with the guy and say, listen, we know that she saw you. She's a very credible witness, but we want to offer you a deal. The Basin can try all these different methods. Let's offer you a deal. You'll pay 90 cents on the dollar instead of a full dollar on the dollar, and we'll call it quits, right? Let's not prolong this because things are not looking good for you. And they'll put more and more pressure on him until finally he'll crack. We said the same thing by video evidence also, right? The guy was filmed on that famous story about the wedding where the two fathers, were each covering different amounts. And when it came time for the father of the bride to pay his amount, he had an envelope of cash, and all of a sudden it was missing from his pocket. And the video showed that the other father, while they were embracing, had lifted the envelope out of his pocket. So apparently this story has existed. I think it's apocryphal, but this story has existed for decades. Okay, and they caught it on the wedding video because they were panning the room, right, during the wedding video, and that broke the marriage, apparently. But then when it comes to litigate, the Basin can't use that as a means of incrimination. So he could say, well, that's a bit doctored video and it just looks that way, but it's not really that way. Or whatever he's going to say, he used deep fake or whatever. But the afal pi sheinam edus min hadin, even though it's not absolute ironclad evidence, mikol malkam yesh lihishtamesh b'hem k'dei ligrom le'echad me'abalidinim lahodos uchadom. But you can still use it to put pressure on one of the litigants to confess. The horas baldin kemeya edim dami, and once he sort of admits, then that's like 100 witnesses. That's reliable. So on that basis, you would use the polygraph exam in the same vein. You would basically say to a guy, look, you failed the polygraph exam. Are you sure you want to continue on with this case? The guy's got a very strong case against you. You failed the polygraph. Let's not prolong the agony. Let's just move on. All right. Okay. Yeah, that's right. There are evidentiary standards that are required and based in to incriminate, but you can use plenty of circumstantial evidence as a means to support it and to push things forward in the case. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to discuss next a private investigator. Can you use what a private investigator's material? Okay, well, that'll be tomorrow, Mirz Hashem. We'll hold it here. Have a great day.